Hello and welcome to the final countdown, practical advice for local plans aiming for examination in 2026. I'm Andrew Megginson, Head of Service for the Plans Examination Service here at the Planning Inspectorate.
And I'm Simon Berkeley. I'm a planning inspector and I'm the professional lead for local plans here at the Planning Inspectorate, or PINS for short. We'll be joined later on in this webinar by some of my inspector colleagues who do local plan examinations. So that we will hear later on from Christa Masters, Louise Crosby and also Johanna Ayres. And they'll be contributing to the popular topics section of today's session. So, just to kind of emphasise, this webinar is designed for local planning authorities who are working towards submitting their local plan for examination under the existing system. And just to avoid any confusion, I mean plans being submitted under the 2012 regulations and aiming for the 31st of December deadline later on this year. So whether you're approaching submission, working through Regulation 19, or maybe still refining your evidence base, we hope this session gives you something genuinely useful that you can take away. So everything that we're going to cover today is absolutely grounded in what we're hearing and seeing directly from you. So we are hoping to answer directly the questions that we have had from you, all your queries and stuff that you've sent us directly to our inbox.
And I'd just like to say from the outset as well is that we know how much work goes into preparing a local plan. These are often complex, resource-intensive documents produced by teams who often have to manage different competing pressures. We've got a great deal of respect for that work, and our aim today is to simply give you the clearest picture we can of what we're looking for and hopefully how we can help you get there as well. Okay, so before we get into the content, just a quick word on how this session's structured. This is a pre-recorded webinar. We've designed it so that you can either watch it from start right through to the finish, or you can use the chapter index to navigate directly to the sections that are most relevant to you. The chapters are clearly signposted throughout the webinar. We also have a Q&A section of around 30 minutes towards the end. That draws on questions you submitted to us in advance, as well as the themes that have come up consistently in recent advisory visits that we've conducted. We've tried to make sure we're addressing the things that are genuinely front of your minds as teams preparing plans this year. This session builds as also on our September 2025 webinar and goes further into areas you told us you wanted more information on. If there's anything as well that we don't get to today, please do get in touch with us, and we'll be flagging this email address up at various points on the screen, but that's plans.admin@planninginspectorate.gov.uk, and we're always happy to hear from you if you have any queries. So in terms of the content, here's what we'll be covering in this section. We'll start with a brief scene setting on where we are in 2026, what this year means for local plan making and why it matters. And then also Simon will take us through a recap of existing system basics, the legal framework, procedural requirements, and the 4 tests of soundness. After that, we'll move into more practical areas that we know are the front of many people's minds right now, including programme officers, conducting advisory visits, and importantly as well, our new pre-examination checklist. Then our colleagues that Simon mentioned earlier on, they'll take us through your most requested topics following our previous local plans webinar. And these were housing need, site selection and housing land supply. And then we'll finish with that Q&A and a wrap up. And just by way of kind of concluding this as well, if anybody has any issues or questions they'd want to ask us outside of this webinar, please get in touch. We're happy to help, and it's an important year that we work collectively to deliver this ambitious target. Okay, so just let's take stock of where we are as we're now into 2026. We know that 2026 is shaping up to be an exceptional year in local plan making, genuinely unlike any we've seen before, particularly in terms of volume and complexity. We're now running 2 systems simultaneously. The new regulations are in force, the new system's underway, and at the same time, more than 100 local planning authorities, I think it's about 114, are planning to submit their plans under the 2012 regulations before 31st of December 2026, before the deadline that's been imposed. So to put that into context, I think, Simon, I think last year we had, I think it was like 35, 36 plans were submitted in 2025. So that sets out the scale of the challenge. And of those 114 plans, 67 of them were expecting to be submitted in December, and I'll return to that later. So the scale of what we're collectively managing this year is unprecedented. So that's the backdrop. It also sits within wider change. We've got local government reform and reorganisation going on in some areas across the country. We've now got an updated national planning policy framework as well, and all of the pace and adaptation that comes with those changes. So we're not going to pretend this isn't a challenging environment this year.
No, a very challenging environment indeed. So, and on that point, our focus today really is firmly on helping you get your plan over the line, on time and at the quality level that it deserves. So everything in this session is very much aimed at that.
Yeah, and also I think just to also mention that we've made internal changes, particularly in terms of the demand that we're expecting. We've recruited a number of new inspectors to deal with that peak demand as well. So we're kind of gearing ourselves up from an operational point of view as well to deal with the challenge that we know you're facing as local authorities submitting before the end of December 2026.
Yeah. Okay, so as Andrew just indicated, I'm going to kick things off by looking at one or two of the basics. Now, I know that many of you will be very, very familiar with this stuff, but I do think it's worth, though, reminding ourselves just before we go into some of the real hardcore detail. So the examination process for plans submitted under the existing system is governed by the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004 as amended. That's the 2024 Act, and by the Town and Country Planning, Local Planning England Regulations 2012, the 2012 regulations. And together, the 2004 Act and the 2012 regulations set the legislative framework for plan making and examination. So I did want to point out that, drawing on that legislation, the Planning Inspectorate's procedure guide, which I think is in its 10th edition now, something like that, sets out the detailed procedural framework that underpins examinations. So although the procedure guide itself has no statutory basis, it is intended as a guide to support everyone involved in plan making and examination as well. So everyone from local authorities, participants, and indeed inspectors. So, and at examination, your inspector will very much be following the general principles in the procedure guide in the interests of consistency, efficiency, and fairness. So, if you haven't read the procedure guide, I definitely encourage you to have a good look at it. It should give you a good insight, a good flavour of what the examination will look like, and what to expect really. So the key stages then leading up to examination that you'll be navigating are your Regulation 18 consultation, your Regulation 19 consultation, and then indeed submission. And each stage carries statutory consultation requirements. You'll very much need to be satisfied that you've met those before proceeding. There is, you will have noticed, a change regarding the duty to cooperate. This has now been removed for plans being prepared under the current system, and as it also won't exist for plans in the new system. But just focusing on the current system, the MPPF is clear on this, and it goes to the question of whether the plan has been positively prepared. So as such, it's very much a matter that you should expect your inspector to scrutinise during the examination. So this means that you'll still need to be able to show what engagement you've done, with whom and when, as well as the outcomes of that engagement as well. So, statements of common ground and or memorandums of understanding with neighbouring authorities and others will still be very, very helpful in this regard. And I'd certainly encourage you to have all of those signed up and ready to go when you submit the plan. If you can do that, that's great. That's going to avoid delays and get the examination off to the best possible start. So in terms then of what needs to be submitted and when, I would certainly encourage you to revisit the pre-examination checklist on this, and we'll be coming on to that shortly. And you'll find that checklist on our website. And the checklist sets out really what inspectors expect to receive at submission, and it's there to help you to be sure that your documentation is complete and in order before you submit, and that will make a real difference to how smoothly the examination progresses. So then still sticking with some of the basics for now, I just want to take a moment just to sort of have a relook really at the tests of soundness. The inspector's role, in short, is to carry out an independent examination of the soundness and legal compliance of your plan, focused entirely on those two things. Hence, soundness is very important. And that's soundness. The inspector will be testing soundness against 4 criteria. And these consequently are the lens through which everything in your plan will be assessed. Again, as I said, these will be well known to many of you, but I do find that revisiting these can be helpful in avoiding common pitfalls, as any issues our inspectors identify with your plan will inevitably relate to one of the soundness tests. So the first test then is that the plan is positively prepared. It must provide a strategy that, as a minimum, seeks to meet the area's objectively assessed needs and is consistent with achieving sustainable development. The second is that the plan must be justified. It must be an appropriate strategy when considered against the reasonable alternatives based on proportionate evidence. The third is that the plan must be effective. That's to say, it should be deliverable over its period and based on effective joint working on cross-boundary strategic matters. The fourth is it must be consistent with national policy. So the plan must enable the delivery of sustainable development in accordance with the policies in the MPPF. So in terms of what a robust evidence base looks like, I think the key qualities are relevance, rigour and currency. So inspectors are always looking at whether the evidence is proportionate to the policies it supports, whether the methodology used in the evidence is appropriate and robust, and whether that evidence remains up to date. So, evidence produced some years ago that hasn't been reviewed since may well not be adequate, and that really is something that I would say is worth assessing honestly, and do that now. Before you submit. We often get asked what proportionate evidence is, and if I'm honest with you, I don't think there's any straightforward, simple answer to this, and that's because it very much depends on what type of evidence you're talking about, and as well the context of the authority area that it relates to. But I'll try and give one or two examples to kind of help illustrate my general thoughts on this point. So if your area is significantly affected by flood risk, say, then the evidence around that will need to be much, much more detailed and rigorous than for an area where flood risk isn't really a big issue. So another example is landscape impacts. So, whether you have national landscape designations in your area, for example, will affect how detailed and up-to-date your landscape evidence will need to be. So, on the other hand, if you're a predominantly urban authority, then it's likely that your landscape evidence won't need to be anything like as detailed. So that's all pretty obvious. But if you have those kind of principles in mind when you're thinking about proportionate evidence, I think that will set you off on the right foot. It's all about the scope, depth and currency of the evidence being proportionate to the local context and the extent to which the issue affects bringing forward the development needed. So just coming back to the question of evidence a little bit more generally then, if you do, when reviewing your evidence base, you do identify gaps, it's genuinely better to address those before submitting your plan than to find that those gaps emerge during the examination. The procedure guide that I mentioned earlier is clear that examinations they're not the place, frankly, to be fixing significant soundness problems. They really do need to be resolved beforehand. An advisory visit, which we will be talking about shortly, can be a really valuable opportunity for you to have that kind of honest conversation with an inspector before you commit to submission.
Okay, so let's talk about programme officers. We know from our conversations with local authorities that the programme officer role can sometimes feel like something to sort out once the plan's further down the tracks and further along in its progression. We gently encourage a different approach, and I'll explain why over the next couple of minutes. The programme officer is a central link between the inspector, the local planning authority and all participants throughout the examination process. It's a role that combines project management and administration, and one that also carries quite a degree of autonomy as well in terms of how they approach that task. So day to day, for those people who maybe haven't used a programme officer before or haven't been involved in an examination, the programme officer manages all correspondence between the inspector and the participants, coordinates the hearing sessions and maintains the examination website and the document library, and also manages the representer database as well. They're the kind of key functions. Outside of hearing sessions, all contact with the inspector will flow through that programme officer. So they're the conduit for correspondence between ourselves at the Planning Inspectorate and the local authority. And there is also a practical requirement worth being aware of as well, is that PINS will generally appoint an inspector, will not generally appoint an inspector, should I say, until the local authority has provided the programme officer's contact details. This isn't a sort of bureaucratic hurdle. It reflects the importance of having that coordination in place from the outset. Having your programme officer confirmed early removes potential delay from the process later down the tracks. Okay, so sticking with programme officers, but moving on to sort of looking at the timing and availability. A question we often get asked is, when should you appoint a programme officer? And I think our answer really should be as early as possible in the process. There's definite advantages to doing that. And ideally at Regulation 19 stage. Appointing at Regulation 19 means that the programme officer can get across the representations that are coming in on the plan through various consultations. They can start setting up the examination website, setting up the document library from the beginning, and be genuinely ready when the submission happens. So if that's not possible, then a programme officer should be in post before the submission. And the PO also, this is worth bearing in mind, should also remain in post until the inspector's final report is delivered as well. So, okay, just looking at this in more depth then, due to the demand challenge that we've previously mentioned, with 114 local planning authorities expected to submit plans for examination this year, experienced programme officers will be in high demand, particularly as we move into the end of 2026 into 2027. And given that independent programme officers book jobs often quite well in advance, if you are hoping to secure an experienced contractor, then my advice would be to make contact well in advance, ideally as soon as possible. And we're also seeing examples of local authorities already doing that and already having sort of tendering processes for that as well. So in terms of sourcing that programme officer, I think finally one thing I wanted to say is that I know that a lot of you have been asking kind of how can you source that programme officer, what's the route? And I think really for us, there are two main routes for appointing a programme officer, and both of them are perfectly valid. Both of them are absolutely fine from our point of view. The first is an in-house secondment or a fixed-term appointment. This is sort of perfectly viable route. For some LPAs, this is the right one. The key condition, though, I think it's important to mention, isn't it, Simon, is that the individual must be completely separate from the planning team and must have had no involvement in the preparation of the plan. So that independence is really essential. I think we see there's quite a lot of upsides to this as well, is that if you're able to second an experienced staff member from within your local authority, from maybe another role elsewhere in the organisation, that may come at no cost to yourselves. They know the organisation, they know the area, they'll know maybe the councillors, they'll know the people making representations, and they're able to commence work swiftly. The second is to appoint an independent contractor. PINS maintains a list of trained independent programme officers. Currently there's around about 25 different individuals, but that list in terms of signposting, that's a signposting resource. It's not an endorsement of any individual. That's still your responsibility as a local authority. And if you want to be directed to that list, please contact us at the plans admin email address. So that's plans.admin@planninginspectorate.gov.uk. That'll appear on the screen. We've seen both routes work well for examinations. So both are perfectly valid. Okay, so after that overview, this also seems like a good opportunity to talk about training for programme officers, because this is something, isn't it, Sam, that PINS undertakes a lot of. So we offer training for all would-be programme officers, new and existing. It's a day-long inspector-led session. I think it's also important to say this is free as well. There's no charge to this training. And as I say, that's suitable for new programme officers, and also maybe any experienced programme officers who wants to come and receive updates. We're staging additional sessions this year given the increase in programme officer demand. So traditionally they've been in London, but we're moving around the country to different locations to make it more accessible, trying to sort of remove any barriers for attendance. Places are limited, so if you have someone in mind for an in-house appointment particularly, then book them onto the training as soon as possible. We're going to firm up exact arrangements, but we've got sessions in June in York, in October in London, November we move to Birmingham, and then December I think we've got Leeds. And more information is available on the gov.uk guidance page for programme officers as well.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about advisory visits. Now, these are something I have to say that we feel very strongly about, and we want to take a moment to explain why we think they're so valuable, and particularly this year, frankly. So if you don't know, an advisory visit is an informal, without prejudice meeting led by a planning inspector. Without prejudice is the key phrase in this. So what is discussed at the visit does not prejudice the examination, and the inspector who conducts the visit won't go on to examine that plan either. So that means that your advisory visit is a genuinely safe and confidential space to explore where your plan stands, what risks it might carry, and what steps you should take to address any sort of soundness issues. So the purpose really is to help you identify potential soundness issues early and prepare more effectively for examination. In terms of the format, many advisory visits these days now sort of take place online. Some still happen face-to-face, but many are online. And most last for around half a day, something like that. And, they're free of charge. What is not to like? So, to request one, do contact us at the plans.admin email address that we've set out previously. So, a note for those of you also thinking ahead to the new system, advisory visits are being replaced by Gateway 2 in the new system. So for existing system plans, advisory visits remain fully available, and we strongly encourage you to make use of them. So on advisory visits, we are often asked about, precisely when to do them, when's the right time to have an advisory visit, and how do we get the most out of them? Well, it kind of varies, if I'm perfectly honest, and there's no one single answer here. Much will depend, but the most common, I think, and most effective point is probably when you're sort of approaching the Regulation 19 stage, before that version of the plan really is finalised. That then gives you the maximum opportunity to take on board any feedback from your inspector before you really lock in your Regulation 19 position. Sometimes I would say a visit after Regulation 19, can be appropriate, particularly, if there have been procedural issues arising at that stage. So, it does very much depend. There is, though, an important practical point on advisory visits for this year, and that is, ideally, they really do need to be completed. You need to have had your advisory visit by the end of the summer. That's to make sure that you have enough time for our inspector to report back to you, and for you and your team then to respond to that feedback meaningfully before you take the plunge and submit the plan. So we very, very strongly encourage you really not to leave your request for an advisory visit until the summer or autumn. We want to be able to accommodate everyone here, and early booking is going to make that much more achievable. In terms of how to make the most out of the visit itself, so it really does help to come with clear questions and a really honest picture of where you think your plan stands. So do think about those aspects of the plan that you'd most value an inspector's view about, and do share the relevant documents in advance as well, where you can. So the more focused and prepared you are, the more useful the conversation with your inspector will be. So We also want to mention that advisory visits aren't the only route to advice. So do have a look at the PINS guidance on gov.uk, and that covers a wide range of procedural and evidential questions. So if you haven't seen that, do go on to gov.uk and have a look at that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I think just add on advisory visits if I can, that Simon mentioned there about booking in an advisory visit. If you would like an advisory visit and you haven't booked one, please contact us as soon as possible. Just to give you an idea about the increase in volume of requests we've had, I think currently we're trying to establish and organise 42 advisory visits across multiple different local authorities. So that's significant work for us. And so the sooner we know about a request, the better. And also, although we're saying we really need them to be completed by the summer to give you time to actually respond to the inspector's findings, any issues that are there, that's not going to be it in terms of our engagement with you. We recognise that there may be a different way of engaging. So instead of an advisory visit, we're looking at ways where if you have issues and problems, to contact us and we can organise almost like a drop-in session, etc. So the key thing here is for us, the more prepared your plan is prior to examination, hopefully the better it will be for us in terms of when we come to examine that. So we very much want that working relationship with yourselves as local authorities. So if you're running up against a problem, please contact us. If you want an advisory visit, please ask for one as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's right. Even after the summer, we'll continue to do as much as we can.
Yeah, there will be engagement on this. It won't be just down to an advisory visit or nothing. It will just maybe be a different type of engagement because of numerous factors we've gone through: demand, availability, timeliness, etc.
Okay, so the next topic that I'm going to cover, albeit rather briefly, is the pre-examination checklist. If you haven't heard of it, this is a document that I would encourage all of you to have open on your desk, have it blue tacked to your wall, have it as your screensaver. But look, this will help you really work through stuff about your evidence base in a really kind of like systematic way. So you can find the checklist on the Planning Inspectorate website. The checklist is non-statutory. It doesn't have the force of law, but it does now, though, form part of the service level agreement that we will be entering into with you when you come to submitting your plan. So what is it? Well, in effect, it's a quality assurance tool. Its purpose is to help you confirm to yourselves before you submit that your plan and the documentation underpinning it are examination ready. So when should you use it? Well, definitely in the run-up to submission. But look, don't save it for the final weeks, right? As I say, use it as a running check throughout preparation. I mean, I'd go so far as to say, frankly, throughout plan making. It'll help you identify any gaps that you might have in your documentation, flag any evidence-based issues, and it'll also help to make sure that your submission package is complete. When you eventually do come to submit. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would just come in and say as well is that if we're able to get the examination checklist a few weeks prior to submission, that's also very, very helpful to us, because there also may be some issues that we pick up as we're running through the checklist with our inspectors that you need to have some time to actually put right and sort of add other information in prior to submission. So it would really help us. For example, if you're looking to submit towards the end of December, as many people are, if we're able to get that in November, for example, that would help us to be able to sort of review that, to assess what's coming in, but also to give you some time to actually put right any issues that we identify prior to examination. So I think that would also be really, really helpful.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so we're now going to move into our popular topics section. So back in September, I think it was last year, we hosted a webinar which was entitled Getting It Right First Time. During that webinar and after that, we asked you as local authorities to vote on any areas you wanted to hear more about. So that was kind of particular themes, topics that you maybe were struggling with or you wanted some more help on. So we've been quite democratic in our approach to this. So the top themes that came through based on a vote in terms of number of people voting for things was housing need and requirement. Also site selection was seen as an important issue and spatial strategy, as was housing land supply as well, and trajectories. So good to our word, our colleagues are now going to take you through each of those different topics, sharing their sort of top tips and insights based on what we regularly see through their examination work. And then I'll note as well that much of what follows is also relevant to those of you who are preparing plans under the new system. So whilst this webinar is very much focused at the current system, the topics I don't think sort of really change, Simon, do we, in terms of the sort of, what we're looking for them in terms of coverage, etc.
Yeah, that's right. I think that a lot of the sort of, technical town and country planning aspects of what our colleagues are about to tell you aren't going to change, or they're not going to change significantly. So, a good deal of what you're going to hear from them next will absolutely remain relevant, pertinent in the new system. That's right.
Hello there, my name is Johanna Ayres. I'm a planning inspector, and today I'm going to give you a short presentation regarding the approach to the housing need and housing requirement in the preparation of your local plan. We will look at correctly establishing the housing requirement, circumstances where a reduced requirement may be justified, and the evidence inspectors expect to see in relation to that matter. So let's begin with the fundamental question: how do we establish the housing requirement? The starting point is a local housing need figure, and that's calculated using the standard method. This figure provides the minimum number of homes needed based on household growth projections and an affordability uplift. It's not on its own the final housing requirement, but it's always the starting point. The next step is to establish the housing requirement. In doing that, you take your local housing need figure and you consider policy on adjustments. These could include the role of the area in the wider housing market, strategic priorities, including economic growth needs, infrastructure considerations, local and sub-regional commitments, and unmet need from neighbouring authorities. Your housing requirement figure should then be tested so that you are satisfied that requirement is deliverable, and you should ensure that you are able to demonstrate how your plan will meet that requirement through the spatial strategy and allocations. There may be instances where a reduced housing requirement is justified, but that's the exception, not the norm. Reductions must be evidence-driven and clearly justified. Those justifications include things like severe environmental constraints, such as areas where you have extensive green belts, national parks, areas of great landscape value. There may be flood risk issues, or indeed protected habitats. If you have one of those areas where you have environmental constraints, you must demonstrate the extent to which those constraints actually limit capacity and why alternatives cannot bridge the gap. Another justification may be infrastructure limitations, and there may be situations where those cannot be addressed within the plan period, and therefore a lower requirement is justified. If critical infrastructure is genuinely constrained and cannot be mitigated within the plan period, that may indeed justify a reduction. However, robust evidence would be required, and that evidence would need to be detailed, costed, and realistic. There may be other exceptional circumstances, but any other reduction must be supported by exceptionally clear evidence. Inspectors will test at examination whether the authority has genuinely explored all reasonable options before lowering the housing requirement. The key principle, as I started with, is that reductions are the exception, not the rule. So the evidence inspectors expect to see in relation to the housing requirement is based on a robust evidence base. Key components include a clear LHN calculation, including any adjustments to the baseline inputs, housing market area analysis to demonstrate functional geography, past delivery data, including persistent underdelivery, demographic modelling, economic evidence such as job growth forecasts, land availability evidence, including a detailed housing and economic land availability assessment, HELA, viability assessments, infrastructure capacity studies. Again, these will include things like transports and utilities and should be robust if you are using them. Duty to cooperate statements, and a housing trajectory to demonstrate how housing delivery and all delivery will unfold across the plan period. At examination, inspectors will explore in detail how the local plan identifies, justifies, and intends to meet its housing need and housing requirement. So inspectors will look to see how the housing requirement was established and whether alternatives were considered, whether the LHN figure has been applied correctly and without unjustified manipulation, whether those figures align with national policy, whether the chosen spatial strategy delivers that requirement sustainably, the realism of the delivery trajectory, particularly for strategic sites, the adequacy of your land supply, including 5-year supply evidence at the point of adoption, cross-boundary matters, especially relating to unmet need and cooperation, whether constraints put forward genuinely justify a reduction, if that's being requested, site-specific issues, including viability, infrastructure, and environmental impacts, and whether the plan, taken as a whole, is positively prepared, justified, effective, and consistent with national policy. So, some top tips in relation to dealing with your housing requirement for local authorities that may be preparing plans. Start with a clear narrative. Demonstrate and explain how your housing requirement has been derived so that everybody can understand it clearly. And document every assumption. Inspectors and all parties involved in the plan process will be looking to scrutinise any gaps and inconsistencies, and you will be expected to explain those at examination. Test your multiple spatial options early, not late. Engage with your neighbouring authorities constructively, even where those relationships are challenging. Make sure that your housing and your economic evidence align. They should not contradict each other. Update your HELA regularly, the backbone of your supply evidence. Ensure that your members' decisions are evidence informed. It may be that there are clear briefings that you can put forward as part of your evidence base to demonstrate why members have made the decisions that they've made, and they should be based on clear evidence. Prepare for examinations early. For those local authorities whose officers may not have a huge amount of local plan experience, encourage officers to go along and watch part of an examination, anticipate what inspector questions might be, identify any weaknesses in your evidence, and make sure that you're ready and prepared to answer questions on that. Be transparent about the constraints if there are any, but avoid overstating them. And keep your evidence base accessible, consistent, cross-referenced, and easy to use for anyone that needs to be using it. Inspectors are not here to try and trip you up. We're here to try and help you get a plan in place. However, you must be prepared to answer questions on that in a constructive way. So in summary, establishing the housing requirement relies on evidence, transparency, and realistic delivery planning. Strong preparation increases the likelihood of a sound local plan.
Hello, my name is Christa Masters and I'm one of the experienced local plans inspectors. If you're watching this, it's because you would like to hear some top tips and key themes in relation to both the preparation of the spatial strategy and site selection parts of your plan preparation. Now, it's worth remembering that there is some considerable flexibility open to local planning authorities in how you choose to carry out the initial stages of your local plan production, and hopefully today will give you some useful insights. As you know, the spatial strategy flows from the vision of the plan, and it should provide an effective basis for meeting the development needs of your area. It's important that your evidence explains how you have assessed reasonable alternatives, and that the evidence before the inspector presents a clear audit trail for both the spatial strategy as well as the site selection parts of the plan. It's also worth remembering that this evidence should inform and shape the spatial strategy selected rather than being collected retrospectively. It's really useful if the evidence base which underpins the spatial strategy is conducted over similar timescales. Inspectors will require and expect robust evidence to support the spatial strategy. This could include urban capacity assessments, the sustainability appraisal, as well as your own consideration of known development constraints. For example, flooding, habitats, national landscapes, and the green belt, where these considerations are relevant. If the approach you have taken through the plan includes changes to the green belt boundaries, it will be necessary to set out explicitly the exceptional circumstances which you have identified and taken into account. This can include reference to any greenbelt study, as this will form part of your evidence base. Conversely, in cases where you've decided through the evidence base that the spatial strategy should not include any release of land from the greenbelt, your evidence should explain the justification for this approach. As you will know, the spatial strategy should relate to the outcomes of the sustainability appraisal work which has been completed. It should be clear to any reader how the spatial strategy has been developed and how the conclusions align with this part of the evidence base, and cross-referencing to this document and the consideration of reasonable alternatives can also be a useful exercise. So let's now move on to the topic of site selection. This is a key component of your local plan preparation and can often be an area of intense scrutiny through the examination process. The hearings may well cover both the process of site selection, including the evidence base which underpins the approach adopted, as well as the soundness of the individual sites allocated. A top tip from me would be to use the Create or Update a Local Plan using the Legacy System website produced by MHCLG. This website provides really useful guidance in relation to understanding the process of identifying, assessing, and selecting sites for allocation in your local plan. As you know, the methodology for site selection should follow the guidance provided by the Planning Practice Guidance, and if you choose not to do this, you should clearly explain why you've chosen an alternative approach. The process you should follow should be transparent to the reader in terms of the conclusions you've drawn regarding the suitability of certain sites and not others. It's really important that the overall process should be led by the evidence base which underpins it, and your approach should be thorough but proportionate. For example, it should be clear how you have run any call for sites exercises. The selection of sites to allocate should also be consistent with the plan's spatial strategy. The executive summary to any site selection evidence should demonstrate the robustness of the approach you have taken and how you have applied your planning judgment to the process adopted. You should also clearly set out how you've taken into account the framework's definitions of deliverable and developable in terms of the sites you have selected. In addition, where sites have been discounted at any stage of the site selection process, you should provide evidence to justify the reasons given. Now, this may well sound obvious, but it's also worth making sure that you've applied the criteria to the sites you have discounted in a consistent manner, and that any anomalies should be supported by robust evidence. Now, it's really up to you to decide how best to present your evidence base in relation to the issue of site selection. Topic papers, flowcharts, and an appropriate cross-referencing to the sustainability appraisal can all assist in building the picture in terms of the approach you've taken. Additionally, be clear about what constraints you have identified and how these have been taken into account. As always, if you are choosing to support your site selection process through a topic paper, please think about how this is presented. There's no need to merely repeat the existing evidence base. A topic paper should really provide a succinct summary as to how you have arrived at the choices you've made in terms of the site selected, and should include appropriate cross-referencing to the evidence base where necessary. Finally, this may well be helpful in terms of the approach for other topic papers, for example, those on housing or employment land, to support the site selection process and aid the inspector in terms of the evidence base supporting this overall approach. Thank you, and I hope you've found this useful.
So my name's Louise Crosby. I'm a planning inspector. Today I'm going to talk through some key themes and top tips in relation to housing land supply and housing trajectories. So National Planning Policy and Planning Practice Guidance provides guidance on housing land supply. So I'm not going to go over that as it's well established, and helpful advice is in the Planning Practice Guidance for you to read for yourselves. So housing land supply is a future supply of land which is suitable, available and achievable for housing. The plan's overall housing provision and the anticipated rate of housing delivery should ensure that there is an adequate ongoing supply of housing land. Importantly, overall housing supply is not the same as the housing requirement. Overall housing supply is a potential figure rather than a firm figure because of the uncertainties in the timing and rate of housing delivery. So your housing land supply figure should usually be higher than the housing requirement to provide headroom and to ensure that the housing requirement is met. Your plan should identify all the components of supply which make up its housing land supply. Typically, these will include things like dwellings completed since the start of the plan period, and that will usually coincide with a base date for the housing need assessment. These are commonly called completions. Dwellings with planning permission or with a resolution to grant planning permission subject to a planning obligation, and these are often referred to as commitments. Sites proposed for allocation in the plan, so allocations, broad locations for growth where appropriate and only from year 6 onwards, and a windfall allowance where justified. You should take care that there is no overlap or double counting between these sources of supply. So even with the best efforts at establishing a realistic housing supply trajectory, there are many variables that affect the start date and delivery rate of housing sites, particularly on large allocated sites. If your plan contains enough headroom, this will provide resilience against potential slippage and under-delivery, and provide greater confidence that a rolling 5-year housing land supply will be maintained. In addition to a housing delivery trajectory in the form of a graph or table, we are now asking you to provide details of every housing site that is allocated, as well as any sites that are not allocations in the plan, but are assumed to contribute towards the 5-year supply following the intended date of adoption. So we've devised a template that you should use for this purpose. The document, which also provides information on how to complete the template, will be added to our website shortly. Relevant up-to-date evidence should be summarised succinctly for each site in the relevant part of the template. This should be proportionate to whether the site is considered deliverable or developable. For larger, more complex sites, statements of common ground with developers can provide useful evidence in relation to site deliverability and timescales. Start dates and build-out rates should be realistic, having regard to developer intentions, but also evidence relating to the timing of previous development on similar sites in the district or elsewhere in the country. Also be realistic about delivery rates and start dates, particularly for larger strategic sites, as these often have longer lead-in times. The information provided should align with the submitted housing trajectory and infrastructure delivery plan, especially for sites that are dependent on the delivery of infrastructure such as a new road junction. It's important that you allow enough time to complete these templates, because failure to complete them as accurately as possible could lead to delays in the examination while further work is undertaken on them. In order to ensure you are able to maintain an adequate housing land supply over the plan period, you should, where possible, identify a good range of sites of different types and sizes for homes, designed to meet different markets and needs. Having a healthy headroom between your requirement and supply can also help. And finally, a transparent housing topic paper covering housing land supply, as well as other housing related matters, is very helpful. It's good to show how housing land supply has been calculated so that it's clear things like over or under supply are being dealt with and what buffer is being applied. Also, justifications for things like the step trajectory, if you've got one, and windfall allowance can also be really helpful for those involved in the examination.
Okay, so now we're going to move into the question and answer section of the webinar. So these questions, they've been drawn from questions that we asked you to submit us prior to recording the webinar. So they're very much from yourselves as local authorities. We've tried to group them by theme. We'll answer them anonymously as well. We're not going to attribute any local authority that asked the question to the answer. We'll keep them fairly generic. And also there's a few in here as well that we've kind of got from advisory visits as well.
Yeah.
So we're seeing the same questions come up at advisory visits. So we thought it was also useful to cover those as well. And I think there's some quite testing ones in here, Simon, as well. So this might test our ability to answer them appropriately. But we'll see how we go.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you very much for that. Not all straightforward questions. No. We will endeavour to do our best.
Yeah. Okay, so the first question we've got is, what are the practical consequences if a local plan does not reach submission by 31st of December 2026?
So yes, I can see why that might be the most upvoted question for us. I suppose a couple of things on that. First up, the 2026 regulations include two things on this. The first is that the deadline for submission is, as the question says, the 31st of December 2026. The more eagle-eyed amongst you watching this webinar may well have spotted that the regulations do also, in effect, allow the Secretary of State to accept, or I think the wording is to direct submissions after the 31st of December, if he so wishes. So just on that, how that might actually work in practice, I currently don't know. Is the honest truth of the matter. But the very clear messaging on that from MHCLG is that exercising the Secretary of State's discretion will very much be the exception rather than the rule. So absolutely do not, plan for a submission that's just a little bit after the 31st of December. I think that everyone should be having that in their mind as a very, very firm deadline.
Okay, so the next question we have is, what must be in place for a plan to be treated as valid at the point of submission?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act 2004, along with the 2012 local plan regulations, specify precisely what needs to be submitted, as a matter of law. So do go and have a look at that. That's really quite clear. It's pretty sort of kind of obvious stuff, I guess, really. So you have to submit your plan, you have to submit your sustainability appraisal and other specified things. So do go and have a look at that. The only thing I think that I can really add to that is, although not must be in place, but what it would be really helpful to include with your submission on day one is a completed pre-examination checklist, which we've talked about earlier in this webinar.
Early is even more helpful.
Absolutely. But do make sure. It'd be really helpful if you can make sure that's all sorted at the latest on submission. But also, and again, we've covered this already, but it bears repeating, I think, do have your programme officer in place and ready to go at the point of submission, even if you haven't been able to follow the ideal route and get the programme officer in place beforehand. Yeah,
and I guess our pre-examination checklist, by working your way through that, that will give you a really clear insight into what we're expecting, because the checklist is a tool that you can use to assess you've got everything in place prior to submission as well. So that's the regulations Simon mentioned and the checklist combined should give you everything you need.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question we've got is, how are legacy system plans examined where national policy changes during plan preparation? So, for example, the NPPF.
Yeah, okay, so if I've understood this correctly, it's really about, you're preparing a plan in the current system that for submission before the end of this year, just to be clear. And yeah, we all know now that we're going to get a new version of the NPPF later on this year. Quite a simple one, this. The new, or certainly the draft at least, new NPPF is clear that it will apply only to plans in the new system. So, when the NPPF is published in its final version later this year, that should not have an effect on plans that will be examined in the current system at all, really. I say it all. There might be some caveats to that, but that draft NPPF, and I'm sure the final version will also include the transitional arrangements as well, which will spell all of that out.
Okay, so the next question we have is, what does a proportionate evidence base look like for plans targeting submission in 2026? Yeah, so proportionate evidence base is a sort of a perennial question. We do get asked this really rather a lot, and it is something that I picked up on in an earlier segment, actually, in this webinar, when I think talking about the tests of soundness. Yeah. So do go and have a listen to that section. But in terms of just to provide an answer here and now, there's no kind of like simple answer to this. It's going to depend on what type of evidence really that you're talking about and the context of the authority area that it relates to as well. Really, the proportionality of evidence, I think, is all about the scope, depth and the currency of evidence being proportionate to the local context and the extent to which the issue in hand affects bringing forward the development that's needed. So just one other thing that I would say about that is that sometimes is proportionate looks like things being clearly explained concisely. That can often be more important, frankly, than volume, and particularly, where the evidence in question is relying on planning judgments. So where planning judgments have been engaged, do be very clear about that. Okay, another question we've had in is, how do inspectors consider viability evidence that relies on future or uncertain funding? So in viability evidence, supporting local plans, there are always going to have to be assumptions that are made, and those really need to be sort of set out transparently and really kind of clearly articulated, so that the inspector can be in absolutely no doubt as to what assumptions have been made, and as well, if I'm honest, how critical those assumptions are, because that is something that the inspector will want to look at. But I'll put it this way: inspectors recognise that in the real world that there is going to be uncertainty around viability and around sources of funding, the precise amounts of funding as well. Inspectors will absolutely recognise that, but at the same time, they do, and it's right that they do, also expect realism. So do make sure that your viability evidence is also, it is kind of realistic, and yeah. So the next question we've had is, with the duty to cooperate removed, what evidence of cross-boundary engagement remains important?
Yeah, I can understand why that question's been asked, and lots of authorities are going to be asking this. It is something that I covered earlier on in the webinar, but just to sort of go over that a little bit again. Engagement is still very, very important. the government's clear that yes, okay, that the duty has now gone, but you should still continue engaging with your neighbours, with statutory consultees, etc. And I think, if I'm honest, in terms of the kind of evidence needed, it's probably not going to be wildly different. To be honest, you're still going to need to demonstrate, what engagement you've done, with whom, and when, and what the outcomes are. Inspectors are still going to be looking at all of that stuff, and also as well, as part and parcel of all of that, statements of common ground and memorandums of understanding are also going to remain important.
Right. Okay, thanks, Simon. Okay, the next question we've got relates to gypsy and traveller provision, and the question is, how should LPAs approach plan making where no deliverable sites are coming forward? That can be very difficult, and it's not an entirely uncommon situation for local authorities to find themselves in either. But in terms of finding sites, the inspector is going to want to make sure that, in effect, the authority has done all that it reasonably could to identify deliverable sites within the authority area in the first instance, but as well, assuming that that there genuinely aren't sufficient sites in the authority area, then the next question in the inspector's mind is going to be, well, okay, so what has the authority done then in terms of engaging with neighbouring authorities, and asking them whether they might be able to help out, meet that need. So that's the kind of starting point, I guess. But inspectors are going to want to see, as part and parcel of that, the sort of evidence of engagement with landowners. Some authorities do try to go down the route of a policy-based approach rather than allocating specific sites, and that that approach needs to be justified, and that can be justified perhaps where the identified need that needs to be met is relatively very small. But that's unlikely, I think, to be found justified where you've got a much larger scale of need that needs to be met. So, and I probably should sort of just put down a reminder that local authorities do have a duty under the public sector equality duty, so that PSED duty becomes engaged throughout this issue as well. Yeah. Okay, so the next question is around sort of hearings and representations, and the question is, how do inspectors view legal representation at examination hearings?
Yeah. Okay. Well, first thing to say on that is that legal representation at the hearings is not a requirement. No authority or any participant, for that matter, needs or must have legal representation at the hearings. That said, though, I think it is often very helpful, and probably for the local authority in particular, perhaps, to be represented by an advocate. Advocates do have particular skills in terms of marshalling evidence and bringing it forward in a very sort of logical, easy for the inspector to access kind of way. They are very skilled in that area. So yeah, they can be helpful. I mean, they're not there when they do participate. They are not to take that sort of adversarial approach that counsel might in other areas. So the hearings are inquisitorial rather than adversarial. And I'll be honest, inspectors are focused really on the evidence and the clarity of the arguments put. So good preparation can be perhaps more important than representation in that respect. but yeah, whether you're using an advocate or not, just make sure that you're focused on making your arguments absolutely clearly, so that the inspector can leave those hearings in no doubt as to where you stand.
Okay, so the final question is related to updating evidence bases. And the question is, if the examination is taking longer than hoped, should an LPA consider updating dated evidence?
Okay, well, as I understand it, the question I'm being asked there is about, the examination is taking place. It's been going on for a while. There's a bit of a concern perhaps about the updatedness of parts of the evidence base. I mean, the first thing to say on that is you're at examination at that stage, right? So the inspector will direct the authority. So authorities ought not be worrying about that. If the inspector considers that there's a problem, then the inspector will might possibly require the authority to update that evidence. I mean, I have to say, perhaps particularly now, as we are in effect coming to the end of the current system, as we're coming towards the 31st of December deadline. I suspect it's likely that inspectors will be slow where there's been a lengthy examination still ongoing. The inspector is likely to be slow to at that kind of juncture to require fresh evidence to be prepared. And I think, it all depends, of course, on the evidence in question. But inspectors, I think, are far more likely to look at what alternative approaches they might be able to take. So that might be around, does this plan need to be updated early? Even perhaps as soon as it's adopted, or and also taking into account in and amongst all of that, when plan making in the new system will have to commence for that authority as well, will also be a factor. I've no doubt that comes into play, because the 2026 regulations do set out when authorities have to begin plan making in the new system. Yeah. So I can't give a definitive answer on that. There are so many kind of parameters, but hopefully what I've said there is at least a little bit helpful. Key message though: if you're at examination, leave it to your inspector.
Thank you. That's Simon. Okay, so we're almost at the end of today's session. So let me just try and bring together some of the key things that we'd like you to take away based on some of the key things we've spoken about during the webinar. So I guess the first one is about timing. We've spoken about the importance of the 31st of December 2026 deadline. So please kind of work to that. If you haven't already mapped out your submission timeline and work sort of backwards from that date, this feels like a great time to do that. See if there's an opportunity to build in any sort of realistic contingency as well. I think the second point is around quality as well. I think we're both clear on that a well-prepared, well-evidenced plan is far more likely to progress through the examination smoothly. And we know that might sound straightforward, but we see real difference in outcomes between plans that arrive with a thorough current evidence base, for example, clear documentation that addresses the 4 tests honestly that Simon outlined earlier on, and also then those that don't. So investing in that quality now is genuinely worth it. I think the third point is about the tools available to you as well. So please make use of them. So advisory visits we've spoken about. If we can complete those, the sooner the better. So there's more time for you as local authorities to respond to any issues that arise out of those. We've also highlighted the pre-examination checklist. Use that as a running quality assurance check, not a last-minute formality. Sort of use it as a tool to assess where you are in your plan-making journey. PIN's guidance on gov.uk as well, and this webinar, which will be indexed, so chapter by chapter, as I mentioned. So, that's available to return to whenever it's useful for you. The fourth point is about your programme officer. If you haven't started the process of securing your programme officer, then we'd encourage you to begin that now. Given the volume of examinations expected, experienced programme officers will be high in demand. Early action gives you more choice and more time to prepare. There's also the programme officer training that we're running as well, so check in on that as well if you need it. And finally from me, a real please keep in touch with us. If your plans or timescales change, it'll make a huge difference to us with the number of plans that we're having coming in. If we know that something is moving forward, we need to know that as soon as possible. So the more we know about where each authority is, the better, and the better that we can support you. You can reach us through the plans admin team, so please use that email address to contact us on any issues you have.
Yeah, so I'd like to echo absolutely everything that Andrew has just said there, and to close with something that I hope is genuinely reassuring, a little something from the heart. You know, the fundamentals of what makes a good local plan haven't changed really. You know, sound evidence, policies that respond to your area's genuine needs, and a plan that addresses the 4 tests of soundness with care and honesty. You know, those things endure regardless of the wider changes in the system.
Yeah.
So, and you know, finally, we know this is a demanding period. We know your teams are working incredibly hard. We get it. And we're here not just to assess your plans, but as well to help you get them to a place where your examination can go as well as it possibly could do. So, you know, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.